Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third virtual sea angling forum from the Angling Trust for 2022. I'm very pleased to welcome this evening Dr. Matt Reed, Adam Fisher and Nick Lewis, who are all from the Countryside and Community Research Institute at the University of Gloucester. And they're going to be talking to us this evening about anglers' participation in fisheries management and science. My name is Stuart. I'm head of campaigns here at the Angling Trust, and working with me this evening is Nevin Hunter, who will be in the background, masterfully managing all the technical aspects and managing the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of Matt, Adam's and Nick's presentation. But before we get into the presentation, I'd just like to explain a little bit about how we're going to run the evening. So we're all sitting here on a Teams webinar feature for this event. We spend our lives on Teams, it seems to be at the moment, and this will help to make it more interactive. So it gives the opportunity to ask questions, and you can do that during Matt, Adam and Nick's presentation by putting your question into the chat function of this Teams webinar. It would help us, I think, if you can try and keep the question as concise as you can. And when we finish the presentation, Nevin will come back on screen and we'll put the questions you've asked to the three gentlemen this evening. Although they do assure me that they will be also keeping an eye on the questions as they come in, so they may well try and answer it during their presentation as well if they spot a question that's relevant to the moment they're in their presentation. When the three guys have finished and we've done the Q&A, I will come back onto screen and explain, or to close the evening and to give you the opportunity to understand what we do for next steps. And also, we hope for you to suggest some of the things that you would like to see us cover in future sea angling forums. But you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Matt, Adam and Nick. So without further ado, I will hand over. I don't know which of you's going first, actually, but I'll hand over to the three guys. So Matt, I think.
It is. Thank you very much, Stuart, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting us for this. So as Stuart said, the three of us will be talking this evening and we will be moving between us. The core of this evening will be a slideshow, but we hope to get through that so we can take questions and have a discussion with you. Just to say that the Countryside and Community Research Institute, the CCRI, is a research institute that's part of the University of Gloucestershire. And although we did this project on behalf of DEFRA, we are an independent research institute that works to university standards. So we are employed to find what we find and report that to people and be honest and candid and based upon evidence. So although we are working for DEFRA, we are independent of them. This project we did 3 years ago, which seems to be, as we were just reflecting, a whole other world before the pandemic and the problems that we currently face. But I think it says things that are still of great importance and things that I think you will recognise from the current situation. And we'll go through the slides, and Adam at the end will talk about his research and studies that he is doing. Just to say that we were asked by DEFRA to assess participation in the fishing sectors in England, and it's about science and management of the fishing sectors, and we looked at the role of anglers, but we also looked at the role of fishers. And I think it's important that we show those two together, because I think that gives you something of the context of where we are and what we found. So just to give us a little bit of orientation before moving into the detail, and maybe this isn't a presentation where there's a gosh at the end, so just to say some of the things that informed what we were thinking about. So we were seeking to understand individual people's perspectives. We have over 600 people in this research. 529 of those people were anglers via an online survey, but at the same time we also did 54 interviews, and we did 9 national level interviews, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we went on. It was the summer of 2019 when we travelled all around England, and we'll talk about where we went shortly. And we have several ideas that inform what we're talking about. So one of those ideas is social capital, which is the idea that the relationships between people are really important for enabling them to be able to do things and for being able to create effects in society. So it's who you know, whether that person is like you, whether that person is different to you, and maybe sometimes somebody who has a higher status to you. And you'll see some of those ideas at play, and we'll explain those in a little bit detail. Also, we use a notion of the ladder of participation, that we can participate at different ways and at different levels. And higher forms of participation are at the top of that ladder, lower forms of participation are at the bottom of that ladder. And also we use this idea of co-management and co-production, that people can work together to manage a resource or to manage, in fact, almost anything, and also that they can create knowledge together, that people have the ability to create knowledge. And the background that much of this was against was the 25-year environment plan and the Fisheries white paper, which did include calls for greater inclusion of fishers and anglers particularly for some of the first time, and also that perhaps they should have a role in collecting data. So just to say where we went, how we did this. So we selected 5 case study harbours, and when I say harbours, we were quite generous in that we roved either side of those harbours to some distance, and we chose those harbours on the basis that we could see angling activity, we could see fishing activity, and that they also had some developments that we felt would be helpful for collecting research. So we went to Plymouth, Weymouth, Brighton and Hove, Scarborough and North Shields. We also did an online survey of sea anglers, and we'll talk about that in some detail. And also we did interviews with people who run national organisations. Everybody who took part, we have guarded their anonymity and their confidentiality, so we don't use people's names and we don't report who said what, so people can be honest and candid with us. When we were at the case study harbours, we interviewed people we found there. So we would sort of come to the end of the pier, have a chat with the anglers who were angling that evening. We would approach people on charter boats or fishers as they were working on their boats, and other people who worked around the harbour, some of whom are really important for facilitating angling. For example, people who work in angling shops are often really important to the angling scene. So that's who we spoke to. In the national interviews, we spoke to people who run large organisations about fishing or marine management. The map to the side is a map of England, and that's actually just showing we plotted when people took part in the online survey, we plotted their postcodes. So we could see where people were, where they might go fishing. And as you can see, it's quite an interesting distribution of anglers, sea anglers, that many of whom actually live pretty close to the coast. There are a few people who have, live quite deeply inland, but quite a lot of them were close to the coast. So that's how we went about collecting our data, and that's how we set about doing what we were aiming to do. So let's just move to the next slide. So I think I'll hand over to Nick, who will just talk us through the online survey.
Right. Good evening. Thanks, Matt. It's a nice introduction to sort of, I suppose, an overview of the project that we did 3 years ago. And I was out doing some of the interviews that Matt has just referred to, but I was also sort of key person involved with the online survey. As I suspect many of you know, we became aware that Facebook is a real sort of key way that sort of anglers sort of communicate with one another, and basically we were trying to infiltrate those groups basically to promote the survey. So myself and Matt were signing up to the Facebook groups, approaching the administrators with an overview of what the work we were doing and why we were contacting them, and basically asking for permission from them to sort of approach their members about the work that we're doing. And there's an example post there from myself for one of the groups. By and large, we were given, sort of approval to take part in the group and promote the survey, and it was met with a range of, I suppose, sort of responses from people. Some hostility from people, and the moderators, which we initially approached, sort of were keen to sort of try and sort of address that and stop it. And a degree of mistrust, some antagonism, but that was perhaps the minority of things, but it was very much there. Other people were very forthcoming with what they wanted to say and were happy to take part. And perhaps some of the people there, some of the people who are with us this evening actually sort of gave us a response. Now, I mentioned sort of the mistrust, and I think was something which was really key that came out of the online survey, and sort of comments which people would have made, which I think Matt will touch on a little bit later. But there was just promotion through a number of groups, primarily, and I think our best success came through Facebook. We also did promote it on Twitter, and again, there was a little bit of perhaps mistrust and things like that from other Twitter users, but we did our very best to sort of respond to people and say, look, we are who we are, and we're not sort of government, so we will be reporting to government, but we'll be doing it in a very honest, anonymous yet and open way. So if Matt could just click on to the next one. There were sort of typical questions about the fishing activities which the respondents would engage with, sort of frequency and sort of expenditure on fishing. But there were also a few other questions in there which I think if you have a look at the slide, you can see some of the questions there which may be a little bit sort of more unusual. And what we were trying to do with regards to that is we took questions from pre-existing national surveys, and those are from the social attitude survey, so they're conducted at a national level, and what we were intending to do and what we were able to do is compare how our sample of sea anglers compared to the general population, and you can see sort of the question there along the lines of how often you take part in sports, leisure, religious, voluntary work, political things, and just to give us I suppose a bit of an overview as to how different or similar anglers are to the broader population, and in particular the question there regarding trust is something which Matt will come back to shortly, which will links in with the extent to which anglers and fishers are involved in science and research at sort of the national level. So I think that's pretty much sort of all I wanted to go through. So I'll probably just hand back to Matt now, and if there are any questions, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box, and if you've got any questions for me, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, so what DEFRA asked us to do was to answer 10 questions which they posed us. So, and we were not coming to a conclusion in this research, which is slightly unusual, but perhaps gives us an interesting opportunity to reflect on things. So we're asking these different questions, and as we go through, the slides will be there, and you'll get a chance to review these again, where we pose the question, and also we've got some of the answers. So our first one was to assess the extent to which individual fishers and anglers and those who represent them see fisheries science and management as participatory. And so we can see a range of answers here. That actually anglers had been very rarely asked their opinions about marine management or had had opportunity to take part in a marine science project. So only 15 or 14, about 15% of anglers had ever been asked their opinions about how the marine environment had been managed. About 15% had chance to take part in a marine science project. And there was also this degree of skepticism that often was based, that people felt that there wasn't a lot of balance, and this quote represents this. I don't think there is any balance. It is just what the scientists come up with. The MMO listen to them and make their decisions. And that was a fisher, but often we heard that similar sentiment from anglers. Now, when we talk to people at a national level, they were much more positive about it. So they felt that the system was much more participatory. When we moved to a local level, people, certainly in the fishing industry, didn't think it was particularly participatory, and anglers really often didn't have any opinion because they'd never really had chance to take part. So the second question, question B, to assess what extent participatory initiatives by bodies such as IFCAs and coastal sea partnerships have been perceived by individual fishers and anglers and their representatives. Well, we came very quickly to the realization that generally things or bodies like the MMO and IFCAs were not particularly well regarded, particularly by fishermen, but generally they weren't well regarded. But there were important exceptions to that, because often people had a relationship with a local officer. And if the local officer in the MMO who they knew, or the local officer in the IFCA, they had a relationship with, then their whole attitude was changed. So if we asked people in general what they felt about the MMO or IFCAs, they had one opinion. If we asked them about somebody they might know or in their local circumstance, then they had another opinion, which was really important to think about. But again, the people working at national level were much more optimistic about this level of participation than those people who were at a local level. So when we came to ask people, we had to understand as awareness, degree and form of partnership working experienced by individual fishers and anglers and their representatives. And this was where we started to come up with this theme that Nick has already sort of highlighted, that very often people had very limited experience of taking part in any forms of partnership working. And so that often coloured what they were able to say. And there was a tendency to be slightly mistrustful of what it was about and what their role in it was. But there was a distinct difference between those people who are fishers, by which we mean people who make their living by commercial fishing, versus those who are anglers. So if we spoke to fishers, and this is a typical quote, that the fishermen would tend to view the organizations as the enemy, and they thought that often they were perceived as villains. This is a very long-standing perception in much of the commercial fishing industry. The anglers, however, were quite different. This is a boat-based angler, but they were saying non-fishing boats can get involved. Anglers should be easier to engage with. They have something overcome the perception that it will always be used to make a ban. But there is a massive scope for more science, but it needs to be easy format and to overcome the lack of trust. So although there were barriers and people were honest about some of those barriers, as we can see in that quote, anglers were more optimistic about taking part in the management of marine areas and in the science. So when we did the Angler survey, and as I've mentioned, we had over 500 responses, one of the things that really took us aback was that over 300 people who took part actually left individual comments. We left a box, as well as asking people to tick box question, we left a box for open text so people could express some of their ideas and why they might want to become more involved in the management of marine areas and take part in marine science. And broadly, we broke these down into three sort of broad groups. So we can see that there's one group who wanted to represent anglers as stakeholders, that anglers should be heard and they should be able to take part because they are stakeholders in the marine environment. And so that's because I feel anglers are rarely taken into account when policy is formulated, and they were talking about the 2018 bass ban. So that was over 200 people of the 500 who took part left this comment, and I can't stress to you how unusual this degree of participation in a survey is. The second largest group were anglers as conservationists. Because I'm interested in conservation, I'm a conservationist, I think this person's trying to say. Over 100 people said that. So they saw themselves as anglers, as conservationists, and they would often be the people who were talking about catch and release and also their observations of the marine environment from a conservationist perspective. And then there were a smaller group, and a much smaller group, who were just interested in learning about how the management of marine areas happens and the mechanisms that take part in that. So what we could see from this, from the anglers who represented themselves and answered this, was there was a very strong interest by anglers of being engaged and being involved, but they hadn't necessarily had that experience. So in question D, we were asked whether people wanted more participation and how that relates to particular processes. And as I've just said, this is just a graphical representation of what we were talking about, but we could see that amongst the anglers, nearly 40% very much wanted to take part and have a greater involvement. And when we spoke overall to people, then actually nearly 55% of combined anglers and fishers all wanted to take part. This is a very clear and strong signal that people wanted to be more involved and take part in managing the marine environment. And this was pretty much across the board. Now, you will notice that in growth groups, there are a small minority, but a not unsubstantial group that we should think about of those people who say they do not want to be involved. And the people who did not want it to be involved, very broadly, felt that participation was pointless. And so they didn't believe that taking part would have any effect or make any difference. So they just didn't want to do it. So that was an interesting thing, because in another way, it's not actually saying that you don't want to take part, it's saying that you believe that there is no point in taking part. Maybe a subtle difference, but quite an important difference. So question E was to understand the form of participation and how people want to be represented. And is that through groups or is that by individuals? How would that participation take place? We found that very few people were members of national organisations, and this is before the involvement of the Angling Trust, but we did not find that many people were members of national organisations, but lots of people belonged to local groups. And those groups were, very important to them, and they were generally very happy with those local groups. So people were organising themselves, maybe on the basis of a county, or maybe on the basis where they carried out their angling, and that was a local club or a local group, and they were very, very satisfied with taking part in those, and often had taken part for a long time in that. Again, we kept finding that the anglers were keen to take part, and as Nick has indicated, one of the things we also found that was really quite important was the importance of Facebook as a place for anglers to meet, discuss, and share information. And through much of this period, partly to make sure the survey worked, certainly Nick and I were members of many angling groups. And that was something that we saw and learned a lot from. Obviously, we were very honest with people that we were researchers and we were investigating this topic. But the other thing that certainly in my case I was able to demonstrate was some very basic knowledge of sea angling, and I was able to supply them with some photographs from the deck of my angling kayak, which kind of proved that I was at least interested personally as well as professionally. But people were really into their local groups, and local groups are really important. But Facebook was an incredibly important place where people met. But that also suggested very much that as well as local groups, people wanted to take part as individuals. Now, this is where we started to break things down a little bit and try and get some depth. And this is where the questions that Nick highlighted earlier became particularly important, because what we were able to do, because we had so many people take part, was to make statistical comparisons with the national data, which is what we're showing here. We were able to broadly, we broke down anglers into two groups, and you may or may not identify yourselves with these. One group we described as the hobby group, and generally this group were fairly interested in angling. They maybe went angling on holiday. They tended to maybe angle in the summer, go fishing in the summer with maybe some friends, and they would describe it as a hobby, something that they enjoyed doing, but they didn't do it very frequently and didn't necessarily spend very much money on it. There are another group who we describe as identity anglers, and identity anglers spent much more money on angling, did it more frequently, very often tended to do it perhaps more on their own, or maybe took part in competitions and clubs more often, and also would consider that their level of expertise in angling was actually quite high. So that's in itself quite interesting findings. But then we were able to take some of this data and compare it with national trends. So what you can see, the red line on this survey is the national trend. And this is the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is a national survey which is statistically valid, that the government run every few years using questions that are carefully vetted and validated. So we know that they're very effective, and they often are internationally comparable. And then the blue line is what the anglers in our survey respond. Now, the blue line actually is suggesting to us that anglers are more trusting than the general population. And we'll unpack that a little bit, why that's important. But certainly we were able to see that anglers were quite different from, or not quite different, but noticeably different in questions of trust from the wider public. That faded out a little bit for older people, but generally that was the case. So when we came to assess perceptions as to the capacity of the organizations, that brought some interesting things. Most of this, because at this point the Angling Trust were not greatly involved, most of this was Fissures, who focused on national organizations, and they were not generally members of the organizations, but they did respect them and think they were important, but tended not to be members and didn't blame them for the fact that national policy wasn't as they wanted. But the anglers had less to say about this question. So when we asked people, and we collated this ourselves, that what are the barriers to taking part? Why do you not take part? So establish the perceived barriers to effective participation. So we looked at this, we talked to people, we looked at what people had said, and we came to 4 big barriers. One of these is what we describe as cultural barriers. The people who make decisions are socially and physically quite distant from the people who want to take part. So that could be that you live a long way from London and that's where decisions are made. But equally, it could be that you don't feel that the people who are making those decisions are like you. Generally, we found that there were quite low levels of trust between people who were fishing and angling and those organizations. I'd have to say that increasingly low levels of trust around policy making are something that we see a lot in this country, but it was particularly acute in this area. So it was particularly a focus of this discussion. The other thing that we've seen already in some of the quotes was that people were suspicious of the motives of why they were being asked to take part. So they were wondering, why am I being asked to take part? Are people genuine in this? Or is this because they want to do something and they want to be able to cover this because I'm taking part? And also that we saw that for many occasions, people, particularly in Westminster, assume that the most important policy is national policy. When we spoke to people, a lot of the issues and questions they had regarded their locality, the waters that they fished, the piers that they might have used, the beach that they went from, the harbour where they tied up their boat. All of those questions often were far more important than national policy. But policymakers and sometimes scientists assumed that national policy was more important. So question H was to understand if there are any patterns such as geography, position in the industry associated with participation and desires for changes in participation. So this is exactly where we sort of came in and started to think about the role and importance of those kind of factors. So certainly when we look at commercial fishers, they have a particular response to these patterns, and we describe this as consolidation, accommodation, and finally innovation. So many of those people involved in commercial angling actually were not quite running down their operations, but did not invest in growing their operations and were really looking just to keep their business ticking over until they retired or stopped. So they were consolidating their business down. The other thing that they did was change their business around the rules. So whatever the rules were, they found a way of working to the edge or within those rules and managing their business in that way. So we saw many people, for example, moving into harvesting shellfish, crabs and lobsters, rather than necessarily fishing for fish because they had easier. And then there were a few people who were doing innovative things. And amongst those innovative things, we saw, for example, some commercial fishermen were also running charter boats for anglers. So that kind of thing was an innovation. Some of them were running restaurants, but that was a small number. Most of what we saw in terms of patterns was that the importance of local communities and relationships. So some of the harbours we went to, there was a very harmonious relationship between anglers and fishers and many of the people who were involved in marine management, whereas in other communities, there were far poorer relationships. One of the key things that we saw that is very closely associated where we see anglers as being people who are capable of being more trusting was the role of long established angling clubs. These are the local clubs that many of you may be members of. They run competitions, they keep going for a number of years, maybe run social events, help young people get involved, and generally keep a communal life amongst anglers going. Those clubs were really important because we could see that those anglers who took part were often those people who were more capable of trust, and equally they were the ones who were interested in representing their sport. So we're coming to the last questions. To identify where and how fishery science and management processes and anglers can contribute to greatest effect. So we said to people, you know, how would you like to take part? How could you take part? What sort of thing would actually be useful to you? So when I mentioned earlier, we asked anglers, you know, how good do you think your fish knowledge is? How good do you think you understand the marine environment? So we asked them, how experienced would you say you are at sea angling? Well, 17% of people said they were experts. Nearly 37% said they had an advanced knowledge. That implies to us that by their own reckoning, they are very knowledgeable about fish and about the marine environment to a lesser degree, but certainly about fish. So then we asked people, you know, if you were going to be involved in a marine researching project, what would encourage you to take part? And this is really interesting. Tell us how it's going to make a difference. That's 58%, nearly 60% said, tell me how it's going to make a difference. That would really help me want to take part. So is it meaningful? And then tell me, this is nearly half the people again, tell me what happened as a result of my participation. What made difference did it make for me? So those are really important findings that, you know, these have to be meaningful projects and people have to be reported to and made to feel involved. And if we look down here, we can start to see that some of the things that perhaps we might expect, like pay me, only 11% of people were interested in being paid. So actually, most of the time, it was about, you know, being part of something and having it reported to you. And you can see, take my ideas seriously. 30% of people would say that that would help them. So what we were looking at was a pattern where participation could be encouraged by telling people that it would make a difference and that the results would be shared with them and that they would be valued and seen as their knowledge would be seen as important. And again, many of the anglers in particular felt that they had something important to share. So we're coming just to a close now, but we wanted to understand what would help make participation more successful. So to understand the vital success factors to partnership working. So what would it be that would really help this work? So we came, and these are quite hard things for some people to hear in this environment. But firstly, because of the low levels of trust, we often said that people didn't invest in relationships with either each other or people who take part in these policy processes because actually it wasn't very rational to do so. They weren't necessarily involved, they weren't necessarily treated very well. So actually, you know, why would people take part? Wasn't really necessarily a thing that you would do. That's quite a tough thing for people in DEFRA to hear, but that's what we said. We did, however, identify that community development officers, and the example of flag officers here, fishing local action groups, they were really important and often made a huge difference. So development workers and people working at the community level really helped things happen. Many people wanted to see locally negotiated agreements, which is back to this theme that I think we've repeated a number of times, that most of the focus, certainly for the anglers and most of the fishers, was actually about where they fish, waters, and the environment that they're part of. The other thing that we discovered was what we describe as an oral culture. Now, this is really important just to pick up because sometimes people misunderstand this. We're not suggesting that anglers or fishers are not literate, that they can't read and write, they don't have high levels of education, anything like that at all. But actually what they value is meeting each other, talking face to face, sharing pictures, sharing videos, sharing stories of their angling and their passion for what they do. And we could see that very, very clearly on Facebook, where people had a very friendly, jokey relationship once we got past those initial barriers, and often shared photographs and videos of what they did. This is a world away from lengthy reports and from the kind of scientific expressions that we often see. So this is what we've described as an oral culture, that seeing people and communicating with each other is really important. The other thing that we sort of talked about is reciprocity and accountability, that actually the people who run this need to be accountable to the people who are stakeholders in the environment, and this needs to run in both directions. So if people are, for example, being fined for taking more fish than they ought to or breaking a rule, then equally those people who apply the rules need to be held to account as well. And then comes another really important point, that the people that we were talking to in the angling community and in the fishing community felt that they had knowledge and expertise of fish and the marine environment that needed to be recognised. And this is slightly different in the sense that very often we can see anglers particularly use the sort of crowdsourcing, that they will provide the data and the scientists will interpret that and tell people what that means. We would be a harder form of citizen science, where actually people are involved in understanding, framing the questions and reporting that back, and some of the analysis. So it's not crowdsourcing, it's actually treating people as citizens who have a real stake in what they're doing. So that's where we came to 3 years ago. I'm just going to hand over to Adam shortly, because Adam's doctoral work picks some of this up and takes it a bit further. So it's time for him to talk about that. There we go.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just thinking, would it be easier just to click through the animations so they're all there? It might make life easier. Okay, just get my camera on. So hi everyone, my name is Adam and I'm midway through my doctoral research on recreational sea angling. So continuing with the baton of fisheries research at the CCRI. My research is overseen by a collaborative team within the CCRI and CFAS, and it's mainly funded by the ESRC. And like Matt was saying, our research does cross over. So my research is focused on understanding heterogeneity amongst the recreational sea angling community in England and Wales. So asking the question whether anglers are similar in their attitudes, their motivations and their behaviours, or whether they fundamentally differ, and if they do fundamentally differ, how can we best describe these different types of angler? And it kind of crosses over with what Matt and Nick's research has done, but my work kind of delves a bit deeper, and it involves a number of different metrics that measure different ways in which people can differ, and I'll maybe just say a few things about that in a bit. So this idea of how anglers differ, well, it's and the question, do they differ? It's really important. We've seen the Fisheries Act recognise recreational sea anglers more so, you know, and recognise that they're key stakeholders within the sort of marine environment policy area. And we've had glimpses of their more formal inclusion, perhaps in future policy. And one thing we know from research conducted elsewhere in parts of Europe, the US and Australia, is that management strategies are more effective if they recognise diversity. So while helping to protect the marine environment, allowing anglers with, for example, different reasons for fishing or different attitudes towards the environment, allowing those different types of anglers to have their expectations met while protecting the environment. The problem for England and Wales is that we have glimpses of data around how anglers may differ and how we could describe those differences, but we don't know the full picture. And we don't know whether these differences actually then carry into or progress into influencing the ways that anglers behave when they fish in terms of sustainable practices. So this is what my PhD research is really about. So the first part is about creating this angler typology, and I'm using the common characteristics that are associated with or recognized as strong predictors of responses to environmental management strategies. And again, building on some of Matt and Nick's work, I've been looking at attitudes to catch, attitudes towards the environment, the relationship or the responsibility of humans to protect the environment, and also things such as how central angling is to one's life, and there's different ways we can measure that. Some of you may have actually completed the survey that I've just distributed earlier this year. If you did, thanks. So yeah, that's just come to a close now actually, and I'm going to be presenting the findings of that survey through the Angling Trust seminar series. So watch this space, and this will, information on that will be disseminated through the Angling Trust newsletter. But the second part of my research is really interesting, because what it's about is it's taking these angler groupings that I've identified through the survey and then applying them in a policy context to understand the impact that differences may have in explaining sustainable angler practices. And I'm going to be using sea bass regulations as a case study in this respect. So looking at factors that affect angler decisions to comply with current sea bass regulations, and whether these factors are common across different angler types, with, for example, different attitudes towards the environment, or different emphases on catch and release, or fishing to consume what you catch. So in terms of that part of my research, I can give you a sort of brief background into the theoretical side of things. When we're talking about compliance and rules, the literature says there are basically two things that mainly influence someone's decision to break the rules or to comply with the rules. And the first drivers of behaviour are what they call instrumental drivers. And this is about people's compliance resulting from fear or the risk of being caught when breaking established rules. But the second behavioural drivers are what we call normative drivers. And these suggests that people comply or they choose not to comply based on, again, crossing over with Matt and Nick's research, based on perceptions of legitimacy of the rules that are in place. Legitimacy is also related to the extent to which anglers are involved in the design of that particular policy or the way that it's managed. But normative drivers also include the idea that someone's behaviour is affected or influenced by the way they think, the way anglers think that other anglers are behaving in relation to the rules, which is really interesting. And also their behaviour can be influenced by peer pressure, what their friends are saying or doing to them. This part of my research is about to start. So it's going to involve interviews with those who catch sea bass, and there's going to be some fun tasks involving taking photos whilst you're fishing. And if this is something that anyone would like to be involved with, my email address is there. So do drop me a line and get in touch, and I can speak to you in more detail about how to get involved and what will be involved. And I think it should be quite fun, actually. So just by a way of conclusion, really, my research hopefully should start to produce some findings and results in the sort of summer of this year, moving into 2023. and I think I'll be working with Nevin and the Angling Trust over the longer term to ensure that my findings are fed back to anglers themselves. So thanks for listening.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. And I'd just also say that you can contact us here through the CCRI website. Follow us on Twitter. Adam, myself, and Nick are available on email if you'd like to. And all of this has been written up in a very large report, which we can forward details of you to. But I thought this evening it would be actually more interesting just to talk about it through. Okay, so I'll stop my slide share there. Great, thank you, everybody. Hopefully that's raised a few questions and provoked a bit of thought. So let's see what we've got. Okay, Nevin.
Okay, thanks guys for the presentation this evening. Okay, I'll start with the first question, which came in from Leslie Holmes, and he says, "What has the government done with the results of the research?"
The results of the research we reported, and that is a really good question. In that, what we have been assured that they have been reading it and using it. They published it in August last year, so it's been publicly available, and we have briefed quite a few people about it. One of the things about our role is that often the government can be a little bit quiet about exactly what they've done, partly because what they're worried about or conscious of is that our job is to report to them rather than to tell them what to do, they would suggest. So that would be a great question if you want to pose that directly of DEFRA, but we have been assured that they've read it and learned lessons from it and used it where appropriate.
Okay, thanks for that. And going on to Malcolm, who I think must have fallen out but has just rejoined us. Malcolm asked earlier, do those who conduct the research understand why so many anglers are dismissive of research and distrusting of engagement?
Well, I hope that our presentation has kind of shown that we are, and also I think that research is a big thing. As hopefully we've also demonstrated, research is there's lots of different research, and we have hopefully tried to show people that we have been understanding of that distrust, and we have worked hard to both report back to people and show people the results of that. So we have hopefully also shown that we've explained very carefully to the people who funded this research why that might happen. So I think Nick's got do you want to jump in there,
yes,
Nick?
Please.
Yeah, I was just going to hang on, let me put my hand down. Just comment on something we were talking about earlier on today, Matt and Nevin, about sort of people who have previously taken part in research and don't tell them anything because they'll use it against you. Comments like that, which when you immediately hear that that's their previous experience, it's completely understandable why people might be hesitant and skeptical about engaging with people such as Matt and myself, even if we aren't from DEFRA. Those experiences may have stemmed from sort of first-hand experience with DEFRA or other sort of national level bodies, but we've always tried to assure them and saying, we're not trying to sort of trick you or anything like that. We're being very honest, open and direct with what we're doing. But from our experience during the project which Matt and I were involved with, and previous ones as well, which go back a few years, when you hear sort of their experiences, which everyone is a product of their experiences, and it's entirely understandable as to why they behave, well, not behave, that makes it sound, why they have the opinions which they hold. I just wanted to dive in and say that, really, Matt, because all too many people have said very, very similar things. and hopefully it will begin to change if indeed it isn't already doing so.
Great, thank you, Nick.
Oh, okay, Matt,
I,
if it's okay with you, what I'll do is I
yeah,
know
yeah,
Malcolm's come back as well, and
yeah. That's
and what I'll try and do, Malcolm, if I'll try and there's yourself and one other person, just bear with me when I get through this. I think trying to keep the theme might be useful here. But if as Malcolm sort of posed that question first of all, if I can just allow, I've allowed you microphone, Malcolm. So I'm sure you've got a supplementary or something you'd like to come back at. If you're able to turn your microphone on and talk now, if you're able to.
Yeah, well, I've turned it on. Are you guys
Yep.
hearing me?
We can.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I perhaps my question wasn't formed quite as well as it should have been. I don't think the distrust is necessarily with the people doing the research. I think the distrust is with the people who fund it, and so you can't see me, I don't think, but I'm, should we say, a fairly seniorly aged person, and I've been fishing for over 60 years, and I've been engaged on a purely voluntary basis on fisheries management, representing the interests of recreational anglers for just over 40 years now. If you could see my office, my home office, it is stuffed with reports and studies. Some of these are fairly major pieces of work by the Drew Associates. The Nautilus Consultants of Edinburgh did one for Wales and did one for the southwest of England. MRAG did some work in Sussex. CMAR used to be heavily involved in at the University of Portsmouth, working very often with CFAS in those days. That's back in the 80s and 90s. It's 40 years of research. And perhaps the one example that really stands out is Tony Blair's Cabinet Office report, which is an analysis of the entire marine fisheries sector. Wonderful report, best part of 400 pages, took 3 to 4 years to put together, led by Professor John Beddington, Chief Scientist of the government, done by some very talented people. And it's all in the filing cabinet in Smith Square, and DEFRA have listened to none of it. Zero. That is why. So it's not the criticism that was implied in my question wasn't at the people doing the research. It is unfortunately at government, who, from my perspective, and I'm speaking almost half a century, have religiously refused to make decisions on the evidence and have perpetually allowed politics to interfere. And by the way, I'm still here. I haven't given up yet.
Well, I mean, I can only commend you, Malcolm, for not giving up, because we sadly we heard other people with your depth of experience say to us exactly the same thing, and that was one of the things that we did report back. And this is what we mean when we were saying to DEFRA that, not engaging and not trusting the system isn't irrational when there's so little trust in the system. So, and that was also the importance of our finding when we were showing that anglers are people who are generally more trusting and more trustworthy in that sense than the general population. So it's not that anglers are particularly suspicious people or people who can't take part in organizations, or this is something that is peculiar to them. Quite the reverse. They're actually a little bit more trusting than the average person. So there's something about the environment that has been created that stops people wanting to engage and stops people believing in it. And that is a real problem of this this kind of topic of the marine environment. We are very fortunate. We work across a number of different communities. So we work with local rural communities and we work with farming communities. And farmers will sometimes say to us things about DEFRA. And, in a moment we will say, you think you've got problems, you should come down and see the marine environment, because there are bigger problems there in terms of trust and behavior. So we have we hear you now. We've heard exactly your peers and colleagues perhaps say to us in privacy exactly the same things, and we've reported that back to DEFRA. Now, the reasons for these, I mean, yes, clearly there is a lot of politics involved in this, and also we've been trying to make an argument to DEFRA through our research that, as I think Adam said, if you involve people, if you engage people, all of the social science indicates that you get better outcomes. And so, you know, it's getting that through. And you cited that report from the Cabinet Office and the work done during those, you know, that sort of 10, 15 years ago. Nick and I were part of some of the latter parts of that research. And so, you know, we absolutely understand when you say it was just filed away and disappeared. That was a year of our lives that exactly the same thing happened to. So I think we share a frustration, and we don't, unless it's, you know, occasionally in our work, sometimes things are very personal to us and people are very rude to us. We try to just shut that off because we understand it's part of the environment. So we're certainly not taking any offense from your question. So hopefully that's addressed it. And yeah, we absolutely do understand what people's frustrations, and we've tried to share that with people. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you very much for a good response. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. And there was some, again, when we were covering the answer to Malcolm's initial question, Ian McGeely quickly raised his hand, and I'm guessing you've got a question and maybe linked to that, Ian. I've turned your microphone on, so if you'd like to ask that as well now, and then what we'll do is we'll move back to the chat questions. I do appreciate Nick Tops has got his hands up, but we'll do the chat questions then. So, Ian, if you're able to turn your microphone on and ask your question. Hello, Ian. Okay, I'll try it once more. Ian, are you able to turn your microphone on? I will. Yeah, I've definitely allowed your microphone, so you should be able to speak if you can turn your microphone on. Okay, I'll try and come back to you later, Ian, on that, but I'll move back to the chat box now. And the question, just bear with me after Malcolm's question. Okay, was. Okay, so from Peter Neal, who asked, who collects opinion and advice from the flag officer? Are they a nationally recognised group? And can we, the AT, create, that's the Angling Trust, create a link between this group and some of our groups, such as the Regional Voluntary Group that we have? Interested in your views on that.
I mean, if you can do that, that would be great. I mean, certainly the flags that we were encountering were in the process of winding down very much because their funding was coming to an end. But we absolutely saw them as a very powerful group, and were doing, you know, we observed what they were doing and we listened to people who spoke of them. So yeah, I mean, I would say that all of those kind of flag officers and other people who were doing that kind of community level development work would be great people to get involved with. I don't know the mechanism for that, but you know, that they would be great people to be involved with.
Okay, well that sort of links in a way because of the issue around data and stuff. John McMaster's the next question, and he says, how does GDPR fit in with sharing data and results of analysis? I appreciate it's slightly different from you potentially sharing names with me, but I'm sure there's ways we can get around that. But yeah, if you're able to answer that, I mean, John's question.
Yeah, sure. So we work under a very stringent GDPR protocols and law. Everybody who took part in the survey would have been given a link to our GDPR statement, and we have a very comprehensive GDPR statement about how we manage and treat data within the CCRI. So that includes things like we use commercial grade online software that collects the data, so it's much more secure than other things that you may have encountered. All of the data is stored very securely on our laptops and our data centers, which are all protected. If you ever visited the CCRI office, which is in a university building, is actually locked away from the rest of the university to make sure that you physically can't access it. And then in terms of all the data that we've shared today, you'll see that we've cleaned off everybody's anything that would allow you to identify who we were talking about and who we talked to. And the other thing that we do with the data is that we remove any identification through the process of analysis. So the people that we report to cannot possibly ever see who presented us with that data. Further to that, when we interview people and we go out and see them, we would tell DEFRA where we've been, but we haven't ever allowed them to know who we've spoken to. And if somebody said something that would allow them to be identified, I don't know, say, you know, I always fish on this beach at this day, we would remove that as well. So we go through that very, very rigorously. And then further to that, because we're at a university, we are under ethical supervision. So we have a committee that looks through all of our questionnaires and all of our questions to make sure that our questions are appropriate and compliant. So hopefully, John, that reassures you that we're looking after people's information. The other thing that we do under GDPR rules is that we will destroy identifying data and make sure that it's not recorded. So at a later date, people can come back and identify people should there be a data breach. So hopefully that answers that question and reassures you.
Okay, Matt, thank you for that. And the next one I've got to ask, because it's from Stuart, and he says, and this is aimed at Adam. Adam, will your research into normative responses look into the fairness across user groups? For example, sea anglers have restrictions on bass, while commercial fishers are given bigger quotas.
Yeah, for sure. That actually plays part of it. Kind of bridges the normative and instrumental divide, that question, because it's actually trust and fairness is actually part of the perceptions of legitimacy of the existing regulations. So yeah, for sure. I'm drafting research materials at the moment, and that is part of the questioning. But yeah, it actually, in the theoretical model, it's part of legitimacy, perceptions of legitimacy of the current regulations.
So can I just ask sort of an additional to that then? So is that issue of fairness then, is that going to be something, you know, people's perception of fairness? Because I know, you know, on what I'll call a day-to-day basis, speaking to sea anglers, this issue comes up time and again of concern. It's the fairness as they would see it, commercial versus what the commercials can do compared to, you know, what they can do as recreational sea anglers taking to when they can take them, etc.
I mean, fairness, I think will come out of my research. It's just in what context does it come out? I mean, if there are perceptions of unfairness, does that mean they disregard rules completely and go by go by what they think is right because they feel that the rules are unfair? So I think it will come out, although I can't predict in what context it will come up. But I think for sure it's definitely an issue.
Okay, yeah. And I see on that, Adam, that Stuart's actually put his hand up directly, so I'm guessing that may be in response to what you said. So Stuart, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, sorry, just quickly, because I don't want to hog the meeting, but you're right, it does, to me, Adam, touch on whether or not you follow the rules or not, but I actually think it also feeds into the question of trust. Because a lot of the time, sea anglers, you know, let's take this year with the fishing opportunities, there was clear evidence and advice from ICs and others that actually sea anglers could have a larger daily bag limit and probably an extended season. They didn't get that, but commercials did get what ICs were recommending, and that immediately touches on that trust issue that, you know, the evidence is there, the information is there, we play by the rules, and yet we get shafted, and that's, you know, that's the problem.
Okay, thanks for that, Stuart. I've got to what I think is the last question on the chat box, and then I'll come to the people with hands up. And the last one is from Tim Coe, and Tim says, can we engage more with tackle manufacturers around the economic benefits that sea angling brings to the economy? I just feel that we are missing a trick, and just wondered, I don't know who's best to potentially cover that or have thoughts on it.
I'm happy to jump in there. part of the detail of what we found was we were looking at expenditure. How much do anglers spend? And you won't be surprised to hear that obviously those people fishing from boats actually can spend quite a lot of money on their hobby, and that's a big impact, and includes things like overnights. And if you talk to charter skippers, obviously they have a big economic impact as well. So it's quite a considerable expenditure. I'd also point out that maybe 15, I'm trying to think, it was 2006 or 2008, there was an economic study done of the economics of angling and inshore fishing, which rather provocatively suggested that perhaps inshore fishing should be stopped and angling should be licensed and charged, and then anglers would then catch a lot more in return for effectively paying for that privilege. Of course, that was politically dynamite, and I think the authors knew it would be, but they were kind of making a point. And so yes, there is a considerable industry around sea angling, and it is, yes, tackle, but also the links into tourism. So it's well worth thinking about. And there's also a question just above, which I thought was really also very on the similar.
I missed that
theme.
one. I was going to come to that in a minute. Yeah, shall I read that one out?
Yeah, go for that.
Okay, so this is from Ian Jones. I do apologise, I missed that, Ian, earlier. He says character and integrity is about what you do when you think no one is watching. Many anglers fish alone. Adam appears to be suggesting that many anglers have no integrity and feel free to break the rules. I think his comment more than anything on that. Yep.
Yeah. I think this is important. I know I'll give Adam a chance in a moment, but this is part of why we were talking about trust, and I think this is really important and kind of corrosive. And I don't think that what we're trying to imply is that anglers are breaking the rules, but we're talking about the environment that's created where people may become tempted to break the rules, or perceive or think that other people are breaking the rules. Because the difficulty about low trust environments where people don't trust each other and they don't feel they're being listened to is you get into a vicious circle where nobody trusts anybody else and assumes the worst of people, which is why we had that little devil figure of motives. I actually think, in my experience of sort of nearly 30 years of social research now, is that overwhelmingly people behave very well. Overwhelmingly people follow the regulations when it's a detriment to themselves. It's the minority of people and how we perceive and deal with that minority that really makes the difference. So that would be what I would argue and what I think I've seen. Adam, of course, can speak for himself.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, that wasn't my intention. Sorry if that was if it came across that way. I think for me, it's just when you look at the literature and the angling literature, the sea bass literature, specifically for England and Wales, it is just a big unknown as to what the level of compliance is around rules and regulations. And there's two things to that. I think firstly, it's about, okay, well, do the current rules and regulations really play a factor in people's behaviour? Or are the rules and regulations completely barking up the wrong tree? Because it might not be risk or knowledge or fear of those regulations that that drive people to act in a sustainable way. It might be influence of their, the influence of how their friends behave or their friends' opinions. If that's the case, why are there rules and regulations that stipulate a minimum landing size? Would it not be better to have signage around, I don't know, saying something like, what are your friends doing? Or, do you see what I'm getting at here? There could be a complete mismatch between the way that sea bass are being managed and the way that anglers act and the things that make them act the way they do. And I think this is reflected in policy making, and I think this is reflected in some of the evidence that's collected inform policy around protected species. It's not something that's really talked about in any documents supporting sea bass policies. You know, this idea of compliance. Yet when you look at the commercial and the recreational sector, and you look at the academic literature, non-compliance is seen as one of the biggest threats to the environment. So that's kind of where my research idea came from, rather than a sort of sinister view of everyone's out there catching 50 bass. And I don't know.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got 15 minutes left, and I think we've done the chat box. If anybody else has got questions and they can't raise a hand, then please do put them in the chat box, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I'll do now is I'll go to the people who have got their hands raised, and I'll start with them in the order that I've got them at the moment showing on my screen. So Nick Tops, first of all. I'll turn your microphone on, Nick. So I've allowed your microphone. If you could turn yours on and then pose your question, please.
Sure, Evan. Yeah, a couple things. Adam and Matthew, in relation to what you've just been saying, I think maybe you need to recognize that us as anglers are disillusioned because of the commercial enterprises approach. We don't distrust each other. You've shown questioning, asking us, and come back and said, anglers are more concerned about this than anybody. So try and recognize that this gap isn't us anglers and amongst them each other, not too sure of each other either. No, we're as a body quite well aware of what we want, where the discrepancies are. And that's why we've got a voice which we're now having to bring to yourselves. Mark, I think more concerning is, can we possibly look at doing this more often? Because this shows how vast some of these gaps are. And have you seen the amount of people here or the questions posed? People are concerned about this. And we need you to understand where we're coming from. That's why you keep asking us at local level what's going on. We're the ones that are there. We understand this. And can I just second what Malcolm says? Because there's a man with an exceptional wealth of information and has spent years at this. I mean, there are more surveys there than any of us could ever wish to do in our own time. How is it that I mean, I know you say you were involved in them, but let's possibly revisit some of these things because the idea is already there. I think bridging this gap could be a little bit easier than we're making it.
I'll let you reply to that, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, our role as researchers, I think, Nick, is to report what we find, and you know, we are reporting what we find. I think that the gaps that we've identified, and we've tried to represent what people have told us very clearly back into the policy process. We don't control that policy process, and we just feed into it. So we you know, our frustration may be as great as yours about some of these matters, but we are only able to reflect and do what we're able to do as researchers. Where our engagement with the policy process ends there once we've written our report and we have no further influence. We might be asked our opinion occasionally, but we're clearly not. The other question about how often this research is done is really something that is in the hands of DEFRA, and also really in the hands of that political process that I think Malcolm identified earlier. So yes, there is a role for anglers to work together and go to that policy process. So we are, I hope, representing accurately what we find, but that is our role, and that's only our role. The people who are actually making the policy are another group of people who, yes, we're interacting with and we're making suggestions to. I agree with you that we have also, and again, I think Malcolm raised this, we have gone through this process before, which is very frustrating to think that we've sometimes asked the same questions again and again. I think the difference this time is that we've suggested ways in which people could get more involved. And again, that's back into the policy and politics of this. That is not our job, but something that we can observe. So I hope that helps. I appreciate your frustration, and I can absolutely understand how, you know, difficult it is, and I would say damaging, when people spend a lot of time on this. And we have tried to say to policymakers that, you know, these sorts of behaviors of, you know, disrespecting people's knowledge, of not including people, of making people feel very frustrated that they're never really listened to, actually is what's damaging this situation. And that, yes, I always feel optimistic that actually we're closer to answers than perhaps we would think, but that does take a jump. And how do we make that jump seems to be the difficult bit. How do we get that conversation? But I don't think it's impossible, but clearly it requires a policy process that is doing different things than it's currently doing. And we've tried to make some suggestions into that. So I hope that helps.
Thanks for your question, Nick.
Yes, it does. I mean, hopefully we can somehow flag this to DEFRA more than not. I mean, this is crucial, them being able to see this engagement. You know, somehow if we can engage them like that, I think it'll make a world of difference. Except instead of being ideas, they're faced with people on their doorstep telling them their problem, and that's important.
I think so, and I would also just jump in, Nevin, and I mean, you know, this is obviously Stuart's job, but one of the things I would observe of some of the commercial bodies is they're pretty good at linking up with their local MP and getting the ear of their local member of parliament or their assembly member if they're in Wales or whatever. And so, you know, that's one of the differences that I would have said I'd noticed between, you know, the commercial sector and the angling sector. But our work, I'm hasten to add, was 3 years ago. So, you know, things may have developed.
Okay, thanks for that, Adam. Thanks, Nick. Conscious again of time, but Ian McGeely, you dropped out, and we did try and get you to speak. I will turn on your. I've allowed your microphone, Ian. So if you want to come back, are you able to speak now? Can Ian McGeely, are you able to turn your microphone on or not? We may. All right, I'm really sorry, Ian. I unless you're able to type it into the chat box, it doesn't look like you're able to turn your microphone on. So the next one I go on is to Leslie Holmes. You've got your hand up, and I've allowed your microphone, Leslie. So if you're able to raise your question now. Hello, Leslie. Can you turn your microphone on? No, okay. I think there are a few other bits in the chat box then, so I do apologise. I'll come back to that now. Just bear with me. Okay.
Yeah, I think Pete's making the point that we were just making, that you know, 100 anglers fishing in a competition, when you put it all together, it's a lot of money, and you know, those are the things I think we perhaps need to think through what that means, and also there are arguments to be made about how angling links into the visitor economy or the tourism economy, because very often anglers are there at different times of year, and that may be really important. So, you know, I'm sure that there are many things that you could raise as a facet of angling that would be compelling, but it's making those cases, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and okay, just in case anybody doesn't have access to the chat box, I'll just read out that question or the comment that Peter raised there, which was, Tim, you raised a very important issue. We certainly must make every effort to obtain current data and use it to lobby government. I attended a shore competition at the weekend with 100 anglers. I spoke to 60 of them being interested in the distance they had travelled to the event. With bait, accommodation, pub and food, my conservative estimate was that those anglers must have spent around £35,000 into the local economy over the weekend, and this is just one event. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important you know, sort of point as well to make there. And one thing I'm just going to something I thought that might be worth me just sharing very quickly was I gave a I gave a short presentation to the Southwest Marine Environment conference a few days ago, and I put this slide up, which I think really reflects perhaps his CFAS and the value of recreational sea angling in research they undertook, 1.5 billion, and then commercial fishing 831 million. Now, I know this is governmental bodies that have put forward those respective values, but I think anybody looking at that, whilst you might argue about the commercial fishing aspect, you can't argue about the fact that recreational sea angling is a massive contributor. And what I was particularly interested, Adam, is with your, if you just bear with me when I come out of this, from your perspective, then, do you think that the impact of the new Fisheries Act then is something that in the future would mean that research that you've undertaken recently would have would reflect significant change, perhaps, in terms of policymaker attitude, because we're now recognised from a recreational sea angling point of view as stakeholders within fisheries in a way we weren't in the past?
You'd hope to think so, but it would still may be a long way off, to be honest. I think I'd have to reflect something that Matt was saying earlier, in that sometimes you can bang on a door for a number of years before things actually happen. But at least it's been recognised formally now in that Fisheries Act, and I think it's just laid the foundation now to start building upon that in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. Ian's obviously got a problem with his microphone, gents. So I'm going to read what he's put on here, and then really just leave it for you to make some comments on there. He's saying that he agrees with Nick just now. The gap between you and all of us is jaw-dropping. I don't know if he means between you as researchers and what Ian perceives as anglers. Red diesel.
I'm an angler. I'm not a researcher.
This issue is killing the sport as you read this. Fishing quotas, Spanish and French waters in French in UK waters, disproportionately expensive tackle and bait costs. I don't know if there's any sort of general. What he's saying here is the Angling Trust needs to come to one of our meetings and see the real feelings on the ground. Well, I don't know which meetings you're specifically referring to there, Ian. Perhaps you'd like to type that just so we've got an idea. If you're talking about a club meeting, then please do. Yeah. Okay, it's a secret over the air. I'm not really sure what you mean by that, so I do apologise, gents. I don't know if you want to make a general comment about.
No. I mean, I think Ian represents a frustration that we've heard a lot, and I mean, yes, if you believe there's a gap between us as you as anglers and us as researchers, well, I can understand that in part. I think, as Adam says, he is an angler. I do occasionally go angling. We are into researchers, people who are reporting to government in a particular form and in a particular way. So we have to be guided by the evidence that we find and be honest with that. So that's what we're doing, and I appreciate that sometimes can see a gap. I hope that what we've sort of demonstrated is that we do understand the frustrations that lead to this, and why this has come about, and we are reflecting that back up into government. And after that, unfortunately, our role is is then limited. So that's exactly what it is. And we're also trying, as we always do, to try and hold a balance of representing everybody we hear. So not just being we're sympathetic to anglers, we're also sympathetic to the commercials as appropriate. So yeah, I hope that kind of explains it. But yes, clearly there is always going to be a gap between how we are asked to express this information and people's feelings of frustration. So I do understand that.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I do. I see that Leslie's written her comments in the question, and the first thing I'll do is apologise. I should have recognised the spelling, Leslie. So I do apologise, because you quite rightly point out. You said I'm female and a member of the Voluntary Bailiff Service, and I work closely with them, but you're obviously in a different region from mine. What she says is your map showed that many of the people who took part in the research are inland. How much do the differing cultures of fresh and marine anglers influence the answers given? Many anglers will speak at local level because they feel that at club level they have real influence, but they have no trust in the government.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there's a couple of questions there, Leslie. So just to break that down, yeah, we weren't in a position, unfortunately, to sort of find out more about the angling histories of those people who took part. So whether they were also freshwater or, you know, game anglers, or whether we were only focused on their identity and their role as sea anglers. So unfortunately, I can't really add very much to that, but it would be a brilliant question for somebody to investigate, wouldn't it? That would be a great question to understand those different cultures, because clearly there are some quite important differences about regulation, licensing, all of those kind of things. And what we would say is maybe sea angling up until now has had a bit more of a permissive situation where you can come and angle and fish, whereas the course fishing is already quite heavily regulated. And I'm sure as a voluntary bailiff, Leslie's very aware of that. And I absolutely get that many people are very concerned and feel able to speak at their level because they have no trust in government. And I would say that one of the things that, to just repeat, that we're also working in other topics in other communities, one of the things that we hear very frequently now from many communities is a very low level of trust in government. So this is not just in the sort of marine environment, but it's increasingly stretching into other environments. So people are very happy and able to work in their local community, but once we move beyond that towards national government, people are increasingly mistrustful. This is perhaps a very acute area where that happens, but we could point to other reports that we are currently presenting to government that would find exactly the same thing. So that low level of trust is really important. And also what I'd say about my concern about low levels of trust is that it is corrosive. We get into a vicious circle. If people don't trust anybody, then how do we move forward? But how do we create trust? And we've been trying to put positive suggestions forward about how we could create some trust.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. And we're pretty much on time now in terms of finishing. And can I just make before I hand over to Stuart, just a comment really from Ian, just to let you know, hopefully you've seen it in the chat box. We have come back to you, Stuart's come back to you, and we will be in contact with you. Just a comment I'll say on these forums, because I've sort of been running every one of them now, and right back to the beginning of last year, where we worked and really tried to work closely on citizen science issues. And one of the issues that we've done, and it actually came up when Adam and I first spoke, was if we engage with yourselves, will you be prepared to then come back when you've undertaken research, so that anglers get an opportunity to listen to your findings and actually feel they've been, where they've contributed? Then that's it's a really not only empowering, but it's a reassuring issue to them to know that when they've taken part, that it's added, and it's added value, but also importantly that nobody's being secret and taken away and using information against them. So I'm really grateful for Adam offering to come back later as well for his research, and obviously we will look to follow that up. So that's great. So I'll hand over now. Thanks to everybody for their questions, and I'll hand over now to Stuart to close the evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nevin, and thanks for moderating the questions and doing all the technical work in the background. And thank you, Matt, Adam and Nick, for a really, really interesting, I think, and fascinating evening, both in terms of what you presented and I think in terms of the discussions and the questions we had as well. I have to say, maybe slightly provocatively, I often find when I read research and research papers, when you get to the conclusion, usually the first conclusion is more research is required. But I think you find with what's been said this evening, that actually when it comes to sea angling and the important role that sea angling plays economically, socially, as well as environmentally within our coastal communities, I don't think more research is required, really. It's always nice to have more research to understand better, but actually what we need is, as you've hinted at, is action, political action. But also I'd say, as somebody who spends a lot of time now working with officials, or not working with, that's the wrong word, talking to officials, sometimes shouting at officials in DEFRA, it is partly political, but it is also cultural. We're trying to change a culture within a group of officials in DEFRA who have been so captured by the commercial industry for so long that they really struggle to see the important role that sea angling and sea anglers play in the management of our marine environment and in the health of many of our coastal communities. And that's work that's going to be ongoing. I can't remember which one of you said it, but I think it was you, Adam. It said, you know, it's going to take time. We're pushing and pushing and pushing, but it will take time. But on that, one thing that it'd be worth everybody watching out for is hopefully next month we will be releasing a report. It's covering desk research. It's not our own research, but it's a report on the socio and economic benefits of sea angling to really start, you know, making that case or setting out that case. And Nick, you mentioned about the great work that Malcolm's done, and Malcolm has been instrumental in helping us pull that report together, you know, and make it there. So thank you very much for this evening. So turning to you, the audience, if there is something you'd like us to cover in a future sea angling forum, do please let us know. We will, as we've done from every sea angling forum, be sending you all a questionnaire, getting your feedback. So it'd be brilliant if you could give us some ideas of the things you want us to also focus on as the Angling Trust and through these forums. And that feedback is also really important in helping us to improve these meetings and to, you know, understand how we can make them more relevant and more engaging for yourselves. If you've not signed up to our monthly sea angling newsletter, do please. You can do that on the website. If you're not a member of the Angling Trust, please join the Angling Trust. It helps us to continue this fight, you know, with the likes of DEFRA and others. I suppose finally, just to say that we have recorded this evening. We will be putting it on the Angling Trust website. So if any of your mates and that wanted to see and follow up, it's going to be there for you to view and revisit. Yeah, just enjoy at your leisure. So finally, thanks again, Matt, Adam, Nick. Great evening, and see everybody hopefully at the next Sea Angling Forum. Bye-bye.